Okay, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. Let me give you a little bit more background. I'm a survivor of being autism spectrum disorder from 60 years ago. 60 years ago, few MDs even knew what autism was, which of course had some interesting challenges. I was a survivor. I survived, fortunately high functioning, and slowly learned to adapt and understand what I worked well with and what I didn't work well with. And later on, in retrospective, suddenly became quite apparent what I was dealing with is now called autism. And not unexpected. Parents were both in the mid-40s when I was born and didn't start the process of learning to speak until I was 8 years old. Again, very characteristic of autistic children. Fortunately, high functioning, which meant I learned and adapted, and as typical for many people with autism, I ended up going into sciences and mathematics. It was simply the natural thing to go into, especially because of the speech problem, not being interested or not realizing that any occupation involving speech was going to be problematic, so ended up going towards the academic bent, particularly mathematics. And was very successful there in high school and university, top in the country in some math competitions. Okay, so a couple of caveats. First of all, I'm not a medical professional. I don't do consultations. However, I will do, when asked, to do blog posts, public blog post on a particular sample and give my reading of it as suggestions to be discussed with your medical professional. Again, I'm not licensed to dispense advice, etc., and I prefer to stay clear of the appearing to practice medicine scenario. So by making everything educational posts, I largely avoid that whole issue. There are many areas where people, when you deal with the microbiome, are interested in things like leaky gut and GI mortality. Those things I'm aware of, but I don't have any great expertise. I'm very much autistic-like, focused on the microbiome and build the site using that, and using the fact that the autistic aspect allowed me to be hyper-focused as well as hyper-concentrate on a topic. So basically, autism helped make me who I am by my learning how to adapt to its characteristics, and I was successful doing so. What I'm going to do is talk about methods. There is no right definitive answer. In fact, that's one of the problems. There is no thing. You're looking for, okay, what should I do? My answer is, well, you go about just a path, that path, that path, that path, that path. I can tell you which one I have a site preference for, and more importantly, I tried building my site to allow anybody to walk down any one of the paths they want to follow up on, so that the information is there. They can reuse it as they choose. Okay, let's go on. And first thing dealing with autism is don't homogenize autism, and that is a bit of a nightmare because it makes things more complicated. We are not dealing with one condition, we are dealing with many different ones, and all these conditions are dropped into what I call a waste paper basket called autism, because it's nice and easy for MDs to refer to, just cluster things as one. The differences in autism can be ascribed to some common factors: DNA or SNPs mutations, historical events like birth weight, mother's use of acetaminophen, etc., mother's age. Could also be due to some microbiome disturbances and to environment. We know that lead in the air or other pollutants has environment and increases the risk of autism. So causes are many. But looking at all the possible causes on how to deal with them, the one that ends up being the easiest to address, especially since you often don't need an MD involvement, is microbiome disturbances. Many other items are what I term water under the bridge. It has happened in the past. going back and visiting what it is doesn't help you deal with the immediate issue, which is how to make life better for your child with autism. Bottom right is a recent study from this year, and the fact that it's heterogeneous population. So the result is what works for Charlie doesn't work for Dave. What works for Mary doesn't work for Violet. It's heterogeneous, which again puts more learning on your plate to work with. Now, where I got into the microbiome was because of ME/CFS. And in some ways we have similarity. A lot of the causalities for ME/CFS and Untitled Autism are similar. Not only are they similar, but often they portray similar symptoms. Example is brain fog, inability to concentrate, poor executive decisions, etc., and sometimes headaches and other characteristics. Sometimes they're environmental. For ME/CFS, often Epstein-Barr, Q fever, Lyme are associated environmental influences which may have caused the ME/CFS. It may have been the cause, but removing the cause may not cause a change because often the cause has already been removed. It's the consequences that it is there. With autism, we have a vast variety of symptoms which are different from patient to patient. Exactly the same situation with ME/CFS. The full listing of ME/CFS symptoms is about 125 different symptoms in the literature. Autism has a great number of symptoms too. A lot of them are similar. And what is interesting, or what is sweet or nice, is that many symptoms appear to be strongly associated to the microbiome. And in fact, there's some interesting studies about it, is that recent study out of China found that for COVID symptoms, there was a direct association with the microbiome. If they had a certain microbiome before they get COVID, they would develop certain symptoms, which is sort of interesting, but also it's illuminating because the microbiome determines the immune system response determines some symptoms. Now, one thing I want to emphasize, because I've seen it with ME/CFS people and suspect some autism people, parents also have it, is things are water under the bridge. Frequently people become focused on the causes, the past, and not the treatment, the future. The root cause may no longer be there. It's actually irrelevant for improving a child's life. What we want to do is going forward. And it's just sort of, it's something which you don't dwell on the past. Growing up with autism, I'd never dwell on the past because it was just going to lead me down a literally depressing road. Okay, one thing is there's something which I've seen often called wrong diagnosis but the right treatment dilemma. Example is some autism patterns are suspected to be caused by Lyme. You go in and they get tested for Lyme. Unfortunately, almost all tests for Lyme are liable, mainly because they are cross-reactive to other viruses. For example, Epstein-Barr is a common virus they are cross-reactive to. And the result of them getting a positive Lyme test is they're treated with antibiotics, minocycline, doxycycline, amoxicillin, etc., and the child improves. The conclusion is that Lyme was the cause. No. It could be the cause, but it's actually more likely to be some other things. One is antibiotics are known to be anti-inflammatory or suppress brain inflammation. You simply may be treating inflammation, and that is the cause of the improvement, and Lyme had nothing to do with it. Antibiotics are also known to modify the microbiome, which are associated with a variety of neurological conditions very strongly in recent literature. So you may actually be modifying the microbiome. Diagnosis was Lyme, rationale, gave antibiotics, things improved. And it's nice, and actually right now in today's medical world, getting antibiotics is often a challenge. You have to prove evidence for needing them almost in order to get supervisors to sign up on them or to survive medical reviews, which means, okay, wrong diagnosis, right treatment, don't argue the point, just see if it works. And if it works, fine, be happy. Generally, when I see the word chronic, just as a personal thing with me, it causes a bit of a red flag that the diagnosis may be incomplete or wrong. It's sort of an easy cop-out, in my opinion, for many people, many physicians treating people. Okay, let's take a look at what the let's get into what the purpose of my talk is, rather than my wandering halfway around the universe on other issues, is the microbiome factor. We have, and you'll find this on the site, what we will find is that there's a whole ton of different diseases and conditions. Autism is one of them. Allergies, Alzheimer's, anorexia nervosa, a whole bunch of things have distinctive microbiome shifts reported in the literature. That they did a study and they found, wait a minute, this particular group of people have too much of this and too little of this, and it's a statistically significant pattern, often significant as 1 in 100,000 being the odds of it's not being there. So what we have is a microbiome associated with conditions. At a high level, a disease or infection may, to borrow a word from sci-fi, terraform the microbiome. It will send out signals to the microbiome to produce what it needs and to stop producing what it doesn't need. So the result is it alters a microbiome, which often happens that after an infection is technically gone, not detectable, symptoms still persist for a while and then fade away. And the reason they persist is that the microbiome is still following the old instructions it's received and hasn't reset itself. So the microbiome factor is something to keep in mind. DNA also favors how the microbiome forms. DNA has interaction there. It's been found that certain DNA combination impacts whether or not certain bacteria take out. So we have a mixed case. So my basic goal is very simple. We want to sabotage the dysfunction at the microbiome level. We want to undo what it did, and we want to do it as fast as we can, but with the least amount of risk. So down the bottom is citations about genetics and the microbiome. For those who are wondering, yes, it is a factor in there. The microbiome is full of factors that potentially complicate trying to do a simple solution. Here is, we have studies on autism, and they are growing, and I'm just going to swing over and bring across a page. So if you go to my site, you click log on, and if you go here and use the biome site example login, and the reason I went there is because it puts you up into a high privilege to access information, and what we want to do is go over to Microbiome Reports, and there's a page. So if you go down here to autism, you'll find here is the literature, the book site being the literature on it. Here is if you have your own sample, how you compare your sample to what is in the literature, the actual bacteria which are being reported, candidates for what may correct the microbiome, test ranking if you're looking at what tests to do, distribution, which is indicating how far or close you are to the definitions from the literature, but I'll come back to all of that later. If you click autism here, we have, you will, if you do just quick login, you'll find you get all 37 articles listed there, and you will find that you get a full text either here or for this one you will get For example, ketogenic diet, you click here. Fingers crossed. Ta-da! And now you get a full text of the study, so it hopefully will speed up your getting up to speed, because now you can get not just a summary, you can get a full text and read through the full text very quickly. Okay, let's get back to the presentation. So we have the studies there. Generally, once a month, I go through the latest publications from PubMed and update it, so this list will keep growing as new studies are released. One of the things to be aware of, and that is the studies will indicate something, and then the next study will say the exact opposite, which tends to be frustrating. Often they are consistent, 3 different studies all saying low, 3 studies, all 2 saying high, and 1 saying low. And the gotcha is there is no universal shift there. Diet and DNA will cause variation. So the one person may go high, another person may go low. And that comes back to the bottom line is that testing is needed to be able to know what path to walk on. You cannot just say, oh, okay, this is what somebody with autism has, therefore I will do it. No, different subgroups in autism have different shifts, and you need to find out what your child's shift is to be able to correctly deal with it. And the shift tends to drive down. Okay, now I come to the next area, which is alternative treatment. Or how do we find out how to treat it? First, let's describe how conventional medicine science does, which is correct. But if you have a child with autism, you really want things to improve before he starts collecting old age pension. So classically, someone proposes the clinical study, overall results are reported, and it's slowly disseminated out to physician. And by slowly, I mean slowly. My best example I know of is in 1954. There was evidence that ulcer was caused could be treated with antibiotics successfully. But it wasn't until the mid-90s, 45 years later, that the CDC started doing an aggressive advertising program to inform physicians that ulcers could be treated with antibiotics. Just took 45 years. Generally, the best time we can look at from a concept to clinical use is 5+ years. If we are dealing with standard of practice, it's not 5 years, it's usually 15 to 20 years. So, classic moves slowly, unfortunately. And usually the studies are dealing with overall. Non-responders or adverse responses are usually not mentioned in studies or just mentioned in passing. And more importantly, often they involve prescription drugs only because Big Pharma is doing the funding. So that is the classic pattern. That is what MDs were trained in university to accept as how we should go about it. Microbiome Approach does a end run. As you know, autistic people tend not to be that sensitive to social pressure, which is something which I definitely have. I tend to be creative, independent, and not prone to be swayed by social pressures very much at all. The microbiome approach, basically, it's simple. You get a microbiome result. You identify what the outliers are. You look out how to modify the outliers. And then you implement non-prescription modifiers of your own choosing. It's fast. 4 weeks processing time from taking a sample to get results back. And then you can go and start trying it and seeing if it works or doesn't work for your child. Nice, simple. Even simpler or better is you are using things which are in general non-prescription, generally recognized as safe, and or probably very safe, and it's there. In few cases, you may get MDs who are willing to try some off-label prescription drugs. The database I have includes prescription drugs, so you can actually get suggestions for possible things to discuss there. And hopefully some of this may lead to clinical studies, but again, clinical studies are a slow process, unfortunately. Main aspect of the approach I'm advocating to be considered is very low risk and has a significant risk of having significant positive impact. In other words, it's a good deal. Let's take a look at how a microbiome sample is done, because there's some gotchas in interpreting things. You get your stool, whichever type of stool you have. This comes from the Bristol stool types. You may want to look it up. I have your stools, if you don't insist on privacy in the toilet. A little sample is taken, put in a test tube, is sent off, is put through a machine which does PCR amplification. It produces a data file, which is often called a FASTQ file, which is like a DNA file. It's just a whole bunch of letters, 4 letters in different sequences going on for miles and miles. Usually anywhere from 8 to 25 megabytes of file. So it's a big file. It's now processed through software. Here we have software company number 1, software company number 2. Both of them may get the identical same data file. They will interpret, they do pattern matching to the RNA, and you get 2 different reports. And lo and behold, report 1 has certain bacteria, report 2 doesn't have it. Report 2 has 1, and report 1 doesn't have it. So you immediately throw up your hand and say, wait a minute, which one is right? And unfortunately, both are right or both are wrong, depending on there. The reports are fuzzy. If you want to get some background of it, it's very simple. This comes from the National Institute of Science and Technology, the official government thing. Guess what? 2019, same FASTQ data file processed could produce 97 different reports. And that's because there's no standardization. Everybody's trying to use this different partial information to get their results. And the result is you get no definitive report. You get a good report. You get it accurate for the data it was using. But reports are not compatible from one provider to another because they use different software. So let's go on. When we go and look at the report, a couple of things to bear in mind. If they give you ranges of standards, take it with a big grain of salt. If so much salt that you may become hypertensive from having too much salt. Generally, the ranges are based on adults, not kids. And that is a dilemma with looking at children with autism, because what is normal is even harder to discern. And here at the bottom left, I have a chart from one study, and you can see the person's up age, and you can see how a particular bacteria, the numbers shift, grow up for age. From 1 to 10, there's a fair amount of dramatic change. From 10 to 20, it slows down. Once you hit about 20 to about 60 or 70, it's very stable. So there is a age factor coming into it. So you really should be asking for age-specific reference ranges. Unfortunately, I know no one who provides that information, although I understand BiomeSite is considering trying to get that type of information. Childhood diet also impacts this. Again, China is excelling at doing microbiome studies. I mean, they're excelling because they have the technology, they have the cheap costs, and they're able, with their variety of medical systems and persuasion, to get large sample populations being done, which makes it much easier to get good basis information. Here we have, down here on the bottom right, we have have microbiome for kids from 3 to 36 months, so young kids, and we have the patterns according to which bacteria they have in different cities. In other words, a generic Chinese diet, but depending on the city they are in and the local variations in diet, you notice there's a fair amount of difference of what is or isn't in there in terms of very high or very top of the hierarchical structure of bacteria. So if you're looking for definitive answers, it's frustrating. Okay, so let's go step by step. I should say it's frustrating, but it's not unsolvable. It's just that you have to do a technique called fuzzy logic, which means you are not getting a definitive answer, you're just getting highly probable answers. Okay, the following are suggested steps. You get a 16S microbiome site, which should be a machine-readable format. There are a lot of providers out there. And a lot of them, well, they don't provide a lot of useful information. They look nice, but you really cannot act on them very well. Thrive Inside is what I use currently, mainly because they're cheap and easy to get hold of in the US. BiomeSite I also make use of. I ship my FASTQ files from Thrive Inside over to BiomeSite, who I actually prefer their website, much nicer. Plus, the staff there are much more aggressive in trying to microbiome reports. Whereas Thrive Inside tends to be a black hole. I send emails after them, nothing ever comes back. And if you're interested in a specific bacteria, I have this link. Will go and show which bacteria, which test reports on. Again, remember, different tests we report on different bacteria. If you're interested in a particular bacteria, it will tell you, does the test I'm looking at buying or using have to specific bacteria? Makes life easier. So once you have your 16S report or 16S RNA microbiome variety of way, most of the people I deal with just refer to it as 16S. We identify the outliers, things which are abnormally high or abnormally low. Then the next thing is we look up what modifies this particular bacteria based on studies from the U.S. National Library of Medicine. So in other words, it's come from the internet, but it's not. It comes from published medical studies on the internet, which being read and data being extracted. Some items will increase variety of bacteria, and others will decrease it. So we look up and say, okay, what increases, what decreases? How do I improve the dysfunction? As in, bring the low ones up to the middle or the high ones down to the middle. It helps determine which subsets are acceptable. Some of the suggestions may not be acceptable to you. For example, if you are East Indian, the suggestion of eating raw beef may be very unacceptable to you. It may be a valid suggestion based on studies, but it may not be personally accepted, etc. So the purpose is to give all the available suggestions for better or for worse, and you can just pick what you are comfortable with doing. Figure out what you're going to do. Try it. Usually I suggest at least 4 weeks of trying it, and then go back and do another test sample. It's not a test cures you all. It's an iterative step. The first step will alter your microbiome. You get a new microbiome, which will have a different degree of dysfunction, and then only have to go to the next one and the next one. So it's an iterative step. And it does work. I've used it successfully for myself for some relapses. Okay, let's talk about a 16S report. You basically want a report that has significant details. And the report should give a percentage down to the species level of bacteria. and the report should be uploadable on CSV or TSV. TSV is what Nirvana makes use of. And the preferences, my preferences are there. Over here you can see why I have the preference here. This is from people who have already uploaded. You can see how many bacteria is typically reported, what's the highest number I've got in any one sample, and what's the lowest number. The Xenogen, which is a Spanish firm, beats everybody else. Also is much more expensive. It's something like, I think, $800 a test, whereas BiomeSite and Thrive Insight are $50 to the $100 range. So you get more information, you get more detail. Unfortunately, the additional detail you have doesn't buy you very much traction, because you will get a whole bunch of bacteria named, and if you tried searching for information on these new strains, you may be lucky to find 2 articles on PubMed about them, and nothing which is useful for treating it. So Thrive Alive and Thrive Insight and BiomeSite are generally the best trade-off for usable information for the cost. Okay, we want to identify outliers, where things have gone wrong. And here we end up, I don't mean to be tossing manure at some of these business, but often we have providers using per forma logic. Number one is most labs will automatically do a bell curve distribution, calculate 2 standard deviations, and that now becomes their normal abnormal. Works well for majority of lab tests, does not work well for the microbiome. In fact, it does a horrible time. The ideal thing is you get actual percentile. Are you in the top 5% or the bottom 5%? Percentile means, very simply, you take all the values, you line them up in order, and if there's 100 values, bottom 5% means you want, the 5% means you want the top 5 values. So the percent info than anything else I was saying. Raw count, they lead you into the wrong path. After 3 years of fighting the numbers, it's the wrong path. Percentile alone may not indicate it's abnormal. You can get high, but still be in the range of a normal population. And keyword, there ain't anything as a normal microbiome. There is nothing. It's elusive. It's like saying, oh, what's the average American? Okay, what color? What is the skin color? How much does he earn, etc. If you really go down to the definition of average American, they perhaps have 1.7 kids. So find me somebody with 1.7 kids. Doesn't work. Okay, here's some real data. Here is a class of data, and here is the percentile ranking, and here's the number. And you notice that the curve is no bell curve. That doesn't look like a bell at all. And a bell curve has a characteristic which any statistician will tell you. If there's a normal distribution of bell curve, the most common value would be just about in the middle. The median, the 50% will be in the middle, and the average would be in the middle. So all 3 of them would be right about the same spot on the bell curve. So if you look at how the bell curve goes, the most common is where the peak of the bell curve. The median, which is halfway up, again, it's in the middle. And the average generally would be pretty close to there. Well, where do we find? We have the most common value, being way down here. We have the average being up here, and somewhere in here at 50th percentile is where the median is. They should all be almost the same point. They're not. They're scattered from one end of the graph to the other. It's not a bell curve. You cannot use a normal distribution. You cannot take an average and standard deviation. Totally wrong. Believe me, as a statistician, that is absolutely the worst way to interpret the numbers. What I found, checking with some data science friend, is there's a process called the Kaltoff-Moultrie algorithm. It's proprietary, but I got permission to make use of it. And we can show you very quickly on a chart what it is. what we do is we take the values here and we go and compute the logarithms of them. And then when you compute the logarithm of it, you get a bizarre thing showing up. You get almost a straight line, and then the bottom and the top you get things change. And what the Kalthoff-Malthoff does, it goes and determines when this beautifully straight line, which we really don't know why it's a straight line, but it's a beautifully straight line when it ceases being straight line at one end or ceases being straight line at the other end. And at that point in time, looking at the data and only looking at the data with no other context, you can say, okay, something is abnormally happening there. So the pattern was strong and persistent. Some cases, it would be absolutely straight line to the very top. Other cases, straight line to the very bottom. So only one side is odd. That's fine. But it is once I discovered it and looked at numbers, my light went on and said, okay, guess what? That is exactly something that makes sense. Dealing with all the variations of diet, of DNA, and everything else, when you have somebody getting off the straight line, when you take the log of the values against percentiles, then something is definitely odd happening. So my site does a mechanical computation of it, and we go down and on most of the pages with bacteria, it will give you lower boundary and upper boundary, and now I will go and list, if I have obtained from any other sources, what other people deem to be low or high. So it's there for reference, and as you can see here, my high boundary is higher than anybody else's, but not particularly too far out of sight. Low value is well between some of the others, so it's there. So it is a interesting, clever way by which we can detect abnormalities when we've got very heterogeneous, very uglily mixed data with a whole bunch of different factors, age, diet, other medical conditions, all intertwined, and it seems to produce very reliable results. Okay, a few sites, for example, Nirvana or Cosmo, does report percentiles, and that should be there. The percentile gives the relative abundance, and then percentile here, which is effectively what I did. The problem is we don't know if the percentile is before this corner happens or not. It gives us better. You can assume something like 95 percentile up or 5 percentile down is probably a matter of concern, but it's nicer to have more compelling data. A couple of things I should point out is there's a nice range here, 25 to 67.5. Interquartile range. In other words, you take all the numbers and divide it into four groups, a quantile. And it means that we're looking at 25 percentile to 75 percentile. That's the middle 50%. Okay, so are you in range or not? You're not. Okay, person's not in range. But one catch is if you go down here, and you have 10 items here, how many do you expect to be out of the range? I'll tell you, 5, because 50% are expected to be out of range, which means you get a lot of what probably are very false positives for things you should correct. In other words, you're going to be busy chasing things that you have no need to be chasing, and chances are you're going to be ignoring what you should be chasing. So I wanted to give an explanation of it so that IQR interquartile ranges, and most of the ranges gives you a range, but you need to be a statistician to interpret it, and most of the time, if going as a statistician, you say, okay, that's nice, that doesn't tell me anything that's usable. It doesn't tell me if there's actually a problem. It just gives me numbers, and of course, showing numbers on page makes the many customers happier, which means the vendor is happier. Okay, so here's a presentation. Here's the interquartile range on the chart we looked at earlier. And you can see if from here to here is the middle 50%, and values down here, I don't see a problem with those values. Values up here, I don't see the volume. Where the problem starts is around 97 percentile, and the bottom is about the 3 percentile. The basic problem I see is that the range should fit the data, and do not pretend the data matches a model. The latter is often what is done, because a model, oh, I know what to do. When you don't have a model to apply, you have to be more creative. You have to do more thinking, you have to do more analysis, and often that type of skill is sparse. Okay, on the site, you can determine how you choose things. Personally, I prefer the cutoff multi-drop range. It keeps focus on things that are problematic. However, you do have a choice. You can say, okay, give me the top 3 or bottom 3%, top 6 or bottom 6, 9, 12, 15. And so you can go and say, okay, what is your criteria? You don't have to go with the cutoff multi, which is my preference. You can go with anything on top or bottom 3%, etc. Okay, we also have more information coming out. I went over to the Kyoto Encyclopedia of Gene and Genomics, and they give me all sorts of information about each strain, what bacteria, what it produces in terms of enzymes and chemicals. And I have managed to merge the data. So from the bacteria which is being reported, I can calculate a variety of things such as which enzymes are being produced. And then I can go and do, as I did before, calculate percentiles compared to other people and cutoff ranges. Is this an abnormal amount of this particular enzyme or not compared to everybody else? Again, using the same methodology, and it allows you a different way of approaching it. And the reason the enzyme analysis is important is that often the same enzymes are being used by 10 or 15 different bacteria. By themselves, everybody is quote fine, but all of them are producing at 90%, 90%, 90%, 90%. When you add them all up, the total amount of this enzyme being produced is off the scale. You can never detect that by the 99 because you assume that each one is a standalone component, but they're not. Each item produces enzymes, and those enzymes can push you through the roof. So where we have the information available, it's there, it's computed for you. Okay, let's continue onwards. My site, basically what I do once a month, I sit down and spend a fair number of hours, I won't say how many, to encode information from PubMed studies. And data is what modifies it to which bacteria. For example, here we have probably barley is the item being described, and here are studies dealing with barley and how it impacts the microbiome. And one of our impact is mixed. Some increases, some decreases. So we end up having to do a balance. All my data is open source. You don't trust me? In fact, I tell you, don't trust me. I have the information there. I have the source of my information. Go and read it. If you find a mistake, tell me. I'll correct it. I'm glad to be corrected. This has been a one-man effort with a lot of tired eyeballs and a lot of mental exhaustion on occasion. So I expect some mistakes to be made, but I suspect my accuracy is probably at least 95 to 98% accurate. And there's a few tricks which I've done to try reducing the risk of bad data having a major influence. So modifiers are all coming from PubMed. No folk tales or whatever, no personal experiences or whatever. Now, one of the things on the Facebook group that came up is that one aspect of the microbiome is you may be able to predict if something that's suggested will help or not help. If you have a recent sample, the premise that some symptoms are caused by dysbiosis of the microbiome, and you have a drug or substance, for example, cucumbers or blueberries, etc., you may be able to look up and see whether or not it will be a positive or negative impact on the dysbiosis as a whole. If it's a negative impact, you may want to think twice about taking it, and perhaps even look for alternatives to the same class of items. If it improves it, you're happy. So it gives you a way to model whether or not it's going to be a good or bad reaction before taking it. It doesn't guarantee it's going to be a correct forecast, but I believe it's probably has a reasonably high success rate, probably 75% or more. I've not tested it, not in a situation to test easily. So we can model what the impact is, which is nice using the science. Very nice, because it takes away some speculation, or at least reduces speculation. It is a very individual, something like with DNA testing, you determine if you respond to some drugs. Some DNA are sensitive to certain drugs. The microbiome is also susceptible to certain drugs. So it's the same type of thing. There is an interplay happening here, and we have a reasonable chance of predicting if it's going to be a good or bad interplay. Suggestions are based on the proprietary algorithm to balance the positive and negative impact. There's one portion of it which I do give probiotics which has positive impact with no negative impact, which is often a small list. But most of the time, it's a trade-off between 4 or 5 items. You've got 25 bacteria trying to modify, and you've got a substance that impacts 10 of them, and it is a juggling act. So, coming from operations research, this type of optimization problem is familiar, and I've implemented an algorithm to try balancing it, and the algorithm has evolved over the last couple of years. There are dozens of reasonable algorithms. In fact, one Microbiome is looking at possibly implementing their own, but using the data from my databases, which is fine. I'm quite willing to make available that data, because my main goal is not to make money. I don't make money. In fact, it was a for poverty website for many years, but to help people, particularly my first one concern was chronic fatigue, CFS. Second one was autism, both of which comes from personal experience. But if you look at how you try figuring out the algorithm, is how do you give the weight for what you're trying to adjust? Do you do it from how far away from the median, the mode, the average, for our boundary criteria? 4 choices right there, and there's more choices. And do you attempt to shift it based on the actual count of the bacteria? So the bigger the number of bacteria, the more you weigh it, or you do something like a log of bacteria, some other weighing mechanism. You end up literally sketching out on paper. You end up with dozens and dozens of possible algorithms you could use. And of course, people are free to make use of whatever algorithms they want. I put my algorithms in there, and it's one which I'm being happy with the prediction ability. Occasionally, I will go back and try improving it, but at the moment, the results are very acceptable. Key thing to remember is the base information is incomplete and occasionally study environment sensitive. Information could be dealing with shift seeing with people with diabetes in Mexico who are taking drugs for diabetics. So you have an ethnic population, you may have an age group population, so all the shifts come from there. In a few cases, I must admit, they come from animal studies. In fact, I frequently find that for some of the rare bacteria, vet studies actually are my biggest source of information. Whether or not it applies to humans is a question, but it is the best information we can locate, and where we don't have the perfect answer, I'm willing to go with the best available answer. Often we have contradictory information. Again, fuzzy logic is used to try to resolve that. And I've also added a link to effective dosages. And the main reason is, or at least in dealing with people with the ME/CFS thing, is often people end up, excuse my expression, homeopathic dosages are not desired. For example, somebody says, oh, but I shouldn't have vitamin D deficiency. I'm taking a multivitamin. You look at the multivitamin and you find that it has 50% of the daily RDA recommended. If the person is my vitamin D deficient, that is not sufficient. So what I've done is I also have the dosages which were used in actual PubMed studies and clinical trials. Dosages which more importantly, one is somebody has investigated to find out what is probably a safe dosage, and two, if the study showed a positive result, it's effective study. We don't know if it will be effective for you, but we know that for some conditions, it did cause enough of a change to have a positive result. In other words, okay, one dosage, if I have the dosage there, go with it. If I don't have the dosage there, email me, and I'll see what I can dig up and add it to the list of items of dosages. Because the whole key thing is, too often people take too small dosages and say, why doesn't it work? Or it doesn't work. Bad-mouthing something that does work. And the reason often, unfortunately, is no one educates them on a dosage. What's on the bottle is not effective dosage always. Okay, suggestions are presented as avoid and take lists. Sometimes when you look at the avoid list, you suddenly realize, wait a minute, I've been taking those things. Oops, I shouldn't be taking those things. And you end up needing to modify your diet to the degree which is practical. The goal is to get better than random suggestions of the internet or wild speculation. It uses more information than most naturopaths or MDs can keep in their mind. It uses over 1 million individual facts to do it. And right now we have just hit 2,000 different samples, so we have a good sample population to develop curves from. So it's good. We rank things by confidence and not by magnitude of impact. Confidence is the key. We don't know. Everything is fuzzy. So the best thing we can do is, this is the most likely, based on more studies saying it does cause this type of shift than something else. Most of the studies don't give relative impacts between things. Comparisons between two substances almost is never done or published in studies. People have preferences. Cost and convenience can be a factor. Key thing is avoid tossing everything at one time. If you toss in a whole bunch of things and it goes bad or good, it's very unclear what is helping or hurting. Do things one at a time and keep tracks. Best practice suggestions, again, this comes from dealing with ME/CFS, but applies to almost any conditions. Subjective evaluation is prone to false memories. False memories is a pain for it. Typically no change. Look for objective measures. For ME/CFS, I use a cheap $40 smartwatch from China. Picked it up on Bang Goods, and it records my temperature every 10 minutes for breathing rate, temperature, pulse rate, hours of sleep, etc. You may want to record a number of tandems per day. You may want to record what shape of stools every time. You may want to time specific activity, like amount of time reading, time focus, how far the person walks. You want to start tracking objectively every day, getting measurements, because that is the best way to see if there is an actual improvement. For example, does a kid get tired from playing a game? How long does it take till he gets tired? You may actually tend to try blanking out the fact that he's playing a game, but you actually want to track how long he plays. The longer he plays, generally the better the cognitive improvements are. And what we are looking for is changes. Do not prejudge them as being good or bad, and I'll come to that in a moment. Usually add a new item every 1 to 2 weeks. Stopping prior item if you suspect an adverse reaction, otherwise keep it in, so you are going to be building. there. And again, take it slow and gentle. You want to make good decisions based on solid, objective observations. No randomness, please. And the key word is repeat and repeat. Modifiers will hopefully change the microbiome, but it will rarely do it direct to the target in the target way. Typically, there's a bunch of course adjustments to do. Okay, I'm going to flip over to the microbiome now to give you a quick look around. And before we go down, I think I'm going to flip a couple slides forward and then come back because we want to talk about something else. Is typical inexperienced mistakes. Changes often take 2 to 4 weeks to appear. Be patient. This is sometimes a hard thing to accept. Don't be surprised if you get a light to moderate Herxheimer's reaction, sometimes called DIAF, often seen with antibiotic manipulations, may occur with some herbs too. There's 2 probiotics I've taken, which when I first started them, oh boy, was I sick. Probiotics may do it because some, not all, produce bacteriocins, which are natural antibiotics against other species. Hey, it's a bacteria versus bacteria in your gut. Bacteria fighting bacteria, and they weaponize. One that gotcha is often commercial bacteria probiotics will pick no or low bacteriocins production. Why? People having reaction to probiotics does not help sales, hence they avoid it. Other cases, the regulatory agencies it may be operating on prefers that one. And those type of ones actually tend to be relatively useless for manipulating the microbiome because you are trying to cause change. And if they just live there and don't impact anybody else, you have no impact. Come back to the key issue. Is it a Herx or an adverse reaction? That is always a hard one to do. It's very subjective. My rule of thumb is very simple. Does the reaction last for a few hours after dosage and then fades away, then disappears? And after the next dosage, does it repeat? If it does, usually I would suspect it's a Herxheimer reaction, something not to be concerned about, apart from keeping it reasonably mild. Whatever substance you are taking, try finding out the half-life in the body of the substance. That would give you some idea of how long a Herx is likely to happen for. Coping strategy, if something happens to become a Herx, start at a very low dosage and work up. Double, perhaps every 3 days, and cut dosage to 50% if the Herx becomes unbearable or problematic. Often, I know I have taken the substance just before bedtime, often will cause me to sleep much harder and longer, and it can become a sleep aid. Basically, the bottom line issue, which I have no answer for, you could discuss with your MD, they may not have much understanding, is the reaction caused by toxin listed by the bacteria killed by the bacterians, which is a good, or is the reaction of the body cells is directed to the substance? For example, the substance could be inducing histamine release. Or is the body reacting to the toxin? Again, we don't know which way it is. There's no easy way to do it. It just needs to be aware that it is something to be considered. You don't want that Herx reaction, which means going slow. But if it does happen, it does not necessarily mean you need to back up from the substance. You need to be wise in the determination. Okay, so I'm going to flip back to the demo part, assuming we are okay time-wise. Let me go in and bring in the demo site. And a quick second, just have to get something up. Okay, and so I'm going to bring in the microbiome site, and I'm going to just quickly walk through what's there. Uploads here are for detail uploads, the one which gives the actual percentages in the thing. We have a fair number of items there: American Gut, Atlas Biome, etc. We have also available videos of how to do things. Basically covers any lab I can persuade to give me data in a usable format. I will write the code to do it. Also have other lab analysis. Other lab analysis are a common one. For example, GI map, GI effects. They are people who sell labs. They generally report on a small number of bacteria, and in general they do not report on what percentage. They use their own reference ranges, which may or may not be correct, may or may not be a good ranges. And they say you're high, you're low, you're very high, you're very low. So all of these ends up being ability for you to transfer the data if you have nothing else. And here's the name of the bacteria, and you just indicate what type of shift it is, and it will actually allow you to make suggestions based on the information you added in. So down the bottom, if you enter in an email, it will save the data connected to your email and send you a login link. And otherwise, you just simply do the analysis. For example, if I have that being extremely high, just one item. And then it goes and gives you a choice of what you want to make use of. And you could say include commercial probiotics 1, how many suggestions you want on the list. The suggestions are ranked order from most confidence to the least confidence. And you click through. And what we have up here is item. And what we have listed here is things that we have, and in this case it's just one item. And if you one item with high value, it's a whole bunch of items with a little bit of value, and click through, and it will go and indicate what bacteria, etc. it does, and gives you your study source if you're interested. Like for example here. They may have had a broken page there, but okay, let's get back. Okay, so we got those two. We have Explorer, and some variety of things. Probably what a lot of people use is my lookup. Lookup for a microbiome modifier. You go in here, the percentage signs are indicator of wildcards. Often you will not necessarily have the correct name, or somebody may do it, so how it's in the database may not be exactly how you refer to it. For example, let's suppose to type the word inulin in here, and we have typo. There we have it. And you can just go in and clear, and it gives estimates from the database we have or whether or not it will make things better or worse. Sometimes again it is assuming nothing more than medical conditions. And down the bottom, bacteria. Notice we have a search bar. If we type in bifidobacteria, it will go in and what the impact is, whether or not we increase it or decrease it. So you get lots of information there. We can also go in and look up a particular bacteria, like for example, let's say Lactobacillus aedephilus. Again, it will give you a list of all the other things it's referred to in medical literature, which is delightful. Talk about naming consistency. What lab tests reports it? One laboratory test reports it 33% of the time. Bottom site reports 6% of the time. Thrive only 1.23% of the time. Again, this is determined by the software the company is using. So some cases they don't detect it very well, or they have a bad mismatch. Okay, symptom report, blah, 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 blah. That's, I'm going to just try covering the medical thing. Supplement dosages. Here we have things listed, and if something isn't listed there and you're interested, drop me an email and I'll track it down. For example, somebody asked me the other day, and I just added alginate and click here, and we find there are two clinical studies. One study used 3,000 milligrams per day, and another one uses 2,000 milligrams per day. So what dosage should you be taking? Probably somewhere up in that ballpark. Same for everything. If we go back, and let's suppose you are when you take a bifidobacterium. Here we have different ones listed, and you can now say, okay, how much should my dosage here be? 1,000 milligrams, which is 1 billion CFUs per day, and there's one study that made use of it, and it was found to be effective. One thing, you're going to get information saturation. Believe me, saturation. Here we have something which is interesting. Usually I advocate that you only use researched probiotics, ones which they give the name of the strain and there are actual studies on. Why? Because some of the things bacteria strains may do nothing, the bottle, no response. In fact, something like one study found that 85% of commercial probiotics do not correctly identify what is in them. They misidentify. There's no regulatory enforcement, so nobody cares. Here, in this case, all of the strains which are being generally patented, which means that the producer of the probiotic has a vested interest in making sure that what is declared to be in it is in fact in it. And over here we have product that is in, if it's known, and to be honest, this has to be a known one. And for example, let's be simple, bacterial cause is simple. So here it will take you over to a site where it is. In this case, it's not available on this site. It may be Amazon site or from European site. So it basically helps you find it. Often you'll be looking for a particular probiotic which you will not find in your health food store. Like for example, this one, which is something like Brurelix, but is a Japanese form of it. And here it is. I will take you to the link. Here is Akkermansia. Here's a project that contains this, another project that contains the need updated. Here's another one which is in the acute. All of these are proprietary strains which are being studied. And if you want to see the studies, right here, you just click here. Cough, cough, cough. Just one is well studied, 293 separate studies, which is painfully great amount of studies. So you can find out exactly what is being demonstrated to do. No speculation. Okay, now I am a teacher who has a tendency to drone on and on and on, but basically go in there and explore around. List people who are willing to do consults if you wish somebody to help you. Bacteria reported by different 16S vendors. gives you a page-by-page comparison. I think I'm probably getting the point of time. So it goes and gives everything. Again, eventually you'll see a search box showing up here to allow you to search the page, but it is a massive page. Okay, I think at that point in time, let's deal with questions, etc. Go off and explore the site. And one other thing, I do have a separate blog which I do post on autism. I've got interesting facts or reviews of people who have given permission to use their results on there. There's a big list there of autism there, and then goes on. So it goes on. Fairmount gives suggestions. So it's a general thing where I post any reviews of microbiome that deals with autism. Okay, questions or whatever else?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.